everyone. Thank you for joining us on The Spin Room. I'm your host, Ami Kaufman. Today we are joined by former Mideast envoy during the Clinton administration and much more, Ambassador Dennis Ross. Thank you, sir, for coming on the show, and Happy New Year.
You too.
In studio to partake in the discussion today are senior editor at honestreporting.com, Daniel Pomerantz, and editor of historycentral.com and Israel correspondent for Newsweek, Mark Schulman. Good to see you both again. Our three topics of discussion today with Ambassador Ross are the protests sweeping across Iran. Are we witnessing a revolution? We'll then discuss regional developments, particularly on the Syrian front, and we'll end our talk with the stalled peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. Our show today will be broadcast on Facebook Live, and we'll be taking your questions that you can leave in the comments section. Okay, our first topic is the protest in Iran. At least 12 people have been killed in 4 days of demonstrations that have spread quickly all over the country. Sir, you were also an advisor to Secretary of State Clinton on Iran. From what we've seen so far in these 4 days, over 4 days now, how do you think these protests are different from what we saw in 2009, and where do you think they're heading?
There's one important, maybe two important distinctions between them. One, in 2009, it was about an election that was perceived as being stolen.
Yeah.
Produced large numbers of people, largely the urban elite in Tehran, smaller protests around the rest of the country, but dramatically focused on the political outcome of an election. This is not focused on the political outcome of an election. This is focused on economic grievances, which include charges of corruption or frustration with corruption, but also frustration with Iran's adventurous policies in the region costing a lot and coming at the expense of Iranians' well-being. What's striking is it is around the country. It is not only the urban elite, it's also the lower middle classes as well. Now there are calls for strikes. Even though there's been an effort by the regime to blunt both the protests but also to cut off access to social media, this thing is continuing to go on. Now, the numbers aren't like they were in 2009.
Yeah, not yet at least. No.
Right. So we don't know. And the regime has proven it has a capability to save itself, use a lot of coercion.
Quite a high number of deaths. I mean, deaths, 12 in 4 days seems like quite a high number.
Well, I think that there's still, I still think they're trying to avoid a kind of massive crackdown. What they proved in 2009 was they were very good at sort of identifying who the leaders were, grabbing them, arresting them, coercing and brutalizing them.
Let me ask you about Donald Trump on this issue. He said that, he tweeted actually, of course, as he usually does, that the world is watching. What's your reaction to that, and how should this administration in general be reacting to these protests? Should it support them vocally or steer away, stay quiet?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to ask, and it's especially interesting because in 2009, and I was part of the decision-making process of this, the decision was made that we should play a low-key response to these. Now, there was a reason for that. The reason was principally we were getting from those within Iran, basically cool it because the regime here is trying to say this is not genuine, it's not authentic, it's not internal, it's being instigated from the outside. Now, I went along with it. I thought that was right, that we should be careful. I think it was a mistake.
Was this careful of Donald Trump, that tweet?
No, I was going to say, I think it was a mistake in 2009.
Yeah.
I don't think we should be silent. Now, having said that...
You don't think we should be silent?
We should not be silent.
Okay.
We should not be. Having said that, Donald Trump doesn't have the image internationally that Obama had in 2009. So he's not exactly seen as a champion of human rights. So shining a spotlight on this, that's the right thing to do.
I want to let our panelists weigh in on this. Should America be more vocal and show its support, or stay quiet? The ambassador says we should be vocal.
I think we have to be vocal. It doesn't make no sense to be quiet. There's nothing to be gained by being quiet. I don't really accept the idea, well, if the administration talks, they can say it's American-inspired. So America has to speak out, even if it's a problem.
You got to be vocal, but there's also a risk that if you take a position, you might eventually be called upon to back up that position.
Israeli Prime Minister Israel Katz was very vocal. Should Israel be vocal or stay quiet?
The problem with Israel being vocal is that it might have a counteractive effect, that Israel takes a position and then people respond again.
If we didn't do anything in Syria, we could have done something in Syria, so we shouldn't be too vocal here.
All right, we have to go for a quick break. When we come back, more with Ambassador Dennis Ross. Stay with us. We're back on The Spin Room with former Mideast Envoy, Ambassador Dennis Ross. And moving on to our next topic, which is regional developments. Let's start with the Iranian presence in Syria as the civil war there winds down. You recently told Israeli radio in an interview there that this administration, the American administration, has no strategy for blocking Iranian presence in Syria. Does this lack of strategy not constitute an abandonment of Israel and its interests?
The Secretary of Defense said we have an anti-ISIS strategy in Syria, not an anti-Iranian strategy in Syria. Well, ISIS is obviously increasingly being defeated there. Yes. Yeah. And who's taking its place? Who's filling the gap? Mm-hmm. Iran and Shia militias. Mm-hmm. So I would say, because the administration has made it very clear it's prepared to counter Iranian destabilizing activities in the region, I would like to see them be more active in terms of trying to affect what happens in Syria.
What could be done?
Well, one thing that could be done is send an unmistakable message to the Russians that we're not going to roll the Iranian, the Shia militias back, but if they continue to expand, we will act to prevent that. You know, the Russians, with a fraction of our air power, sustained and allowed Assad to basically survive. We could, with our air power, we could prevent them from expanding further, and we should do that.
Yeah, is Russia the new kingmaker in the Middle East? I mean, should Israel now be turning to Moscow now to advance its interest in the region, now that we see that they've become basically the victors of this war?
Well, look, I think that they have made themselves an arbiter, which was what Putin wanted to do, not just look like he saved Assad, but to make Russia an arbiter. Israel has no choice but to talk to him anyway because of their presence now in Syria. There's a big difference between talking to deconflict and talking to communicate so there's no misunderstanding and looking at the Russians as somehow being able to shape the region. They can't shape the region, but they've made themselves a factor. And the proof of that is everybody goes to Moscow now. We've had the king of Saudi Arabia go to Moscow. No king of Saudi Arabia had ever gone to Moscow before.
Should Israel be? Go ahead.
Well, you know, as ISIS has been falling, a lot of the militias fighting against ISIS with American support have ultimately been Iraqi Shiite militias who are now sort of forming this circular shape around the Gulf states. The Gulf states are feeling very threatened. That's part of the reason for this controversy between Qatar and other Gulf states, because Qatar is supporting some of these Shiite groups. Where does the United States fall in that? Is there anything the United States can do? If you get rid of ISIS, you get Shiite groups. If you get rid of Shiite groups, what do you have next?
First, the Shiite groups are increasingly positioning themselves in Sunni areas. That's not a prescription for stability.
No,
that's a prescription for recreating the circumstances that produced ISIS in the first place.
Exactly.
So we, the U.S., has a stake, first of all, in eastern Syria, but I would also say even in southern Syria, of not leaving. Now, one thing that Secretary Mattis has signaled is that we're not leaving eastern Syria, although he says we may draw down. We have to decide what we're going to do. How much are we committed to reconstruction there? How much are we committed to security there? How much are we committed to governance there? Now, we can't substitute for others, but we can play a role that helps to ensure that governance, security, inclusion, all of this actually, and reconstruction, all this is done. This is where we actually need to draw the Gulf Arab states in.
I want to ask you about the Iran nuclear deal. You've been critical of this administration's handling regarding the nuclear deal with Iran. What are some of the specific steps you want to see this administration to put more pressure on them?
What I said was I don't want to see the administration walk away from the deal. Not because I think the deal is such a great deal, but because if we walk away from the deal, we make ourselves the issue. The Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese are not walking away from the deal. So what I want us to do is I want us to use the European desire for us not to walk away from the deal to get the Europeans to go along with us on some of the issues that are genuine concerns the administration has. The sunset provisions of the JCPOA, the ballistic missile testing, and the regional activities. If I actually suggested we should appoint a senior envoy from the outside who would go to the Europeans and say, look, we're prepared to take your concerns into account as it relates to the JCPOA, but we also need you to take our concerns into account.
This administration is about to do that kind of stuff, is it?
Well, I haven't seen a sign of it yet, but bear in mind, look, when the president made his October 13th statement, he said the administration was going to talk to the Congress and to our allies about addressing these issues. And the three he raised were the ones I just mentioned.
Do you feel okay with basically critiquing this administration? What we're seeing today in regards to Iran is an outcome of the foreign policy of the administration that you worked for.
It's true. No, look, this administration likes to demonstrate that and President Trump in particular likes to demonstrate he's not Obama. So I wrote an article where I said, look, he's the anti-Obama on every issue but Syria. So I'd like him on Syria also to show that he's different.
Mark?
I think part of the problem, people ask me, well, what's American foreign policy? And I say, I have no idea. Because it requires a comprehensive foreign policy to accomplish any things you just mentioned. And I see no sign whatsoever in the American administration that there's a comprehensive plan for anything. I mean, allies want to work with America on various things at the same time. You know, you can't walk away from climate and then expect people to cooperate on something else. It has to be a cooperative effect on all matters, and I just don't see it happening.
Well, I'll tell you what, there was, America went against the trend of the world on the vote in the General Assembly about Jerusalem, and 2 days later got a unanimous vote on North Korea. So you can disagree with countries on some issues and get their support on others.
Korea is a particular issue where the rest of the world wants to make sure the United States doesn't get into a nuclear war with Korea, so they'll go along at the moment.
All right.
But,
okay, I want to move on to our last topic of the day, sir. Our last topic is the stalled peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. You've been in this business for a long, long time, 20, 30 years, I don't know. Correct me, how many years exactly? 30.
30. But who's
You've
counting?
seen a lot, and now you're no longer a diplomat, so I'm hoping you won't give me a diplomatic answer. Whose fault is it, where we're at right now, that this peace process is stalled?
You know, you don't want a diplomatic answer, but the reality is when you start placing blame, that's all you do. Everything's about scoring points. You want to settle this conflict, you have to get beyond scoring points. Now,
But now you're free to say what you want to say.
well, I've been...
I think the investor's always been pretty open about what
I
he
have been
wanted to
pretty
say.
open. If you go back to the year 2000, I made it very clear who I
Yeah.
thought was to blame.
And now?
And
Where we're at right now?
Look, I think both sides at this point could adopt positions that make discussions more likely. I think Abu Mazen, in the aftermath of the Trump declaration on Jerusalem,
Right.
has put himself in a very difficult position because when
Is that a mistake?
what he's doing?
Yeah.
I think it is a mistake in the following sense, that there is no other mediator in the United States. Doesn't mean that others may not be able to help or play a role, but the only country that has the ability to influence Israel is the United States.
But can you understand their frustration when the U.S. gives the Palestinians a carrot, gives the Israelis a carrot and gives nothing to the Palestinians when it comes to that?
Yes, no, look,
So-
I completely understand the Palestinians being in a position where you take an issue like Jerusalem and you basically embrace the Israeli narrative and you say nothing about the Palestinian
There's a
narrative.
question I've been dying to ask on this very topic. Is shortly before the Jerusalem Declaration, the Trump administration asked the Palestinians 3 different times to stop funding terrorism through the Martyrs Fund. They said no each time. Is it possible that the Trump administration did this not as a reward to Israel, but as a certain kind of punishment to the Palestinians for not going along with their demands on
I don't think so, because the whole national security team recommended not to do the waiver. So if there were those who were going to come in and say, look, we should impose a price on the Palestinians, they should see what the price is for this kind of behavior, they would have been the ones to make that argument.
I describe the current situation as a circular firing squad, or as we call it here, lewat banagmash. Everybody is firing at each other, and nothing is going to take place at this point. Everyone is acting against their own interests, or at least the interest of peace. I can't see no one in the whole phenomenon right now. Abu Mazen's climbing higher and higher onto a tree. The Israelis are doing everything to spit in his face, and the Americans are just acting like they don't understand the details.
Can they still be seen as an honest broker, the Americans, after this?
You know, first of all, the argument has existed for a long time. The United States is not an honest broker. What you need is an effective broker, meaning you have to take the needs of both sides into account, or there's no possibility of an agreement. The U.S. is always going to have a special relationship with Israel. That's just a fact.
Right.
That doesn't make us less of an effective broker. It makes us the only ones who can be a broker.
One could argue it hasn't been very effective over 30 years.
Well, others have had the chance. Well, look, the first term of the Bush administration.
We have to go for a break.
Okay.
I have to go for a break. I'll let you finish that sentence, sir. I'm sorry. When we come back, more with Ambassador Dennis Ross. Stick around. We are back on the spin room with former Middle East envoy Ambassador Dennis Ross. Sir, I interrupted you before you wanted to finish your thought.
Let's say that in the first term of the second Bush administration, they walked away entirely from the peace process. They didn't prevent anybody. They didn't prevent the Europeans from coming in to be the mediator. They didn't prevent the Russians from coming in being the mediator. And nobody did. It wasn't as if there wasn't a vacuum created. So what it says is there's a recognition internationally that probably only the United States can play this role. Now, it may be that others can help. But having someone come in and take the place of the U.S., I don't see it.
What would you have done differently now in hindsight that you know, in retrospect?
There's a couple things I would have done differently. Before going to Camp David, as an example, I would have basically said, we're not going to Camp David unless each leader will say publicly, and we're ready to orchestrate it. Each of you will say you're not going to get 100% of what you want on Jerusalem, borders, refugees, security.
Yeah.
Because there has to be some conditioning of compromise.
Compromise, right.
And my guess is what we would have found is Barack would have done it, and Arafat would not have done it. Now, we would have done that privately. And once we would have found that out, we would have said, all right, you know what? We're going to work on increasing cooperation between the two sides. We're going to work on increasing the scope of Palestinian autonomy.
So you're saying the Americans back then didn't push enough to make people realize that they have to compromise at the end of this?
Publicly.
Publicly.
Privately, that was a constant conversation. It had to be done publicly.
Right.
And the reason it had to be done publicly is because then you find out.
Yeah.
We would have known from Arafat then. He wasn't prepared to do what was necessary. So therefore, we shouldn't have gone to a summit.
What else? Another one, for example.
If I go back earlier, I think one of our mistakes earlier was with the Palestinians on the issue of violence, we should have simply stopped the process. Said, look, you know, you have a responsibility here, you're not fulfilling it.
What period are you talking about exactly?
I'm talking about going back to 94, 95 when you began to have the first bombings.
Right.
You said, the process stops. And we don't play.
Is it possible that you'd end up with no process at that point?
You know what?
Isn't that letting the extremists win?
Look, what we did is we made it okay for Arafat, on the one hand, to sort of go through the motions of being serious on security and understanding there was a threshold here that he could get away with. Well, we had to prevent that.
What do you think of the Taylor Force Act? Can it be effective? Is it just going to cause money to be taken away from other things where we'd like money to be spent?
I think it has to be, I wrote something on this where I said you need to approach it with a scalpel, you know, not a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
Because there are things, what does our money go for? Well, let's see, the security forces, their hospitals, water and some of the infrastructure projects. So I think you have to be careful about what you'd be cutting off. You look at what's happening in Gaza, and that's a recipe for trouble. I wanted to say, though, there was one other.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that on Israeli settlements, we should have done more to contain the spread of Israeli settlements, because what they did is they made the Palestinians feel powerless.
Right.
And when they felt powerless, it gave them a reason to show they could defy.
Which is a good segue, by the way, to my next question. The Likud Central Committee yesterday, the party's top decision-making body, unanimously passed a resolution urging the party leaders to formally annex parts of the West Bank and allow unlimited construction in settlements. How should the U.S., for example, react to that today?
Well, I think the U.S. should at least say privately, well, I would even have the U.S. say publicly, we're against annexation, because that's, in fact, prejudging and preempting the negotiations. I have been in favor of the U.S. establishing a position where Israel should continue to build within the blocks, but not build outside the blocks. What that does is it allows settlement building to be consistent with a two-state outcome. When you build outside the blocks, you have settlement building inconsistent with a two-state outcome.
Mark, it's a symbolic act that the Likud did last night, but it's a very major symbolic act. Would you agree it's important?
It's important, and I think the United States should react very strongly, frankly. Just again, to say that don't translate this into actual law. Very nice, make the statements. It's good politics for the interior people in Likud, but don't translate into law. Actually, something more problematic happened yesterday was when Attorney General Mendelblit told all the Justice Ministry to plan every law from here on in so it applies to the settlements. That is actual changing the law, actually, and that's even worse than the actual statement by Likud.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the peace plan, Ambassador. Do you expect the Trump peace plan that we're waiting for now for quite a long time to be any different or much different than the various plans that other administrations and your administrations have put forward? You do expect it to be different?
The short answer is I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I feel like
they've been in contact with you from the administration.
Well, no, they've reached out to me, but I don't know what's in the plan. I do think they have an environment right now that has to be changed, because anything they present right now is going to produce a no, not only, I think, from the Palestinians, but from the Arabs as well.
Right.
So they need to find a way. I mean, one of the things I've suggested is there should be, I think the president should meet with a senior Arab leader in January and say that when he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, he was very clear that he wasn't prejudging the outcome.
Right.
And when he said he wasn't prejudging the outcome, what that meant is he understood the Palestinians had claims. And those claims going to have to be addressed in the negotiations. And there needs to be some effort to address the Palestinian and the Arab side as it relates to Jerusalem.
Speaking about the Arab side and a more regional aspect, has Trump's announcement on Jerusalem harmed the regional peace effort, you know, that his own administration was pushing?
Well, I think at this point it denied the political space for key Arab leaders to be responsive right now. It doesn't mean that can't be fixed. Look, I wasn't against what Trump said. I was concerned about how he did it.
Right.
The ground wasn't prepared, and the political space that those leaders needed wasn't created.
Okay. That is all the time we have. I want to thank our panelists, Mark Schulman and Daniel Pomerantz, and a special thank you to our guest today, Ambassador Dennis Ross. Thank you, sir, for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with our weekly